Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Harmon Museum's April Lunch and Learn. My name is John Zimkus. I am the Education Director and Historian here. We have a lot in store in the next few weeks here at the museum. First off, I'll let you know that there is a 20% discount at our gift shop right now on non-consignment items. If it is a consignment item, there is a 10% discount. But you can do your last minute Easter basket shopping at the museum. Also there, if you were with us last month, we had James on talk about Frank Duvenet. Well, his book, The Greatest Brush, is now on sale in our museum if you want to pick up a book to go along with that good presentation last month. On April 19th, which is this Saturday, the Ashley and Barbara Ford Maritime Collection will officially be open. There is a private opening ceremony in the morning, but at 1:30 in the afternoon, and we're extending our hours to 5 o'clock in the early evening. It'll be open and you can see it as it is now. You can sort of look through the open area, the glassed area, to see what it's like. But opens officially to the public 1:30 on Saturday. On April 26th will be the last day of our 220 years of Shakers in the West in our Seminary Gallery. From 2 to 4, there'll be a closing reception, which you are invited to join in on that. On May 6th, we are doing our patriotic duty, and we will be a polling place right here in the conference center for the May primary, which I believe has a constitutional amendment up on the ballot. May 8th, music at the museum. Michael Morton, bagpipes. He'll be playing and hopefully you'll be enjoying. And there'll also be some history of the bagpipes there. On May 10th, the annual meeting of the Warren County Historical Society will be meeting at 6:30. If you are a member, please come join us. And of course, on May 21 will be our May Lunch and Learn. That Lunch and Learn will be Military Women's Memorial. Colonel Judy Pearson, retired from the Air Force, will be talking about the memorial at Arlington Cemetery. Coincide just with Memorial Day a few days later. On June 18th, I will have the privilege of being your speaker, and we'll be talking about the Underground Railroad in Warren County, following the tracks of the Underground Railroad. We'll talk about what is known, what is suspected, and what is myth. On July 16th, the gentleman who he and his wife have given us this beautiful maritime collection, Ashley Lloyd Ford, will be our speaker. And he'll be talking about his collection in the talk Crossing the Pond, Oceanic Travel Before the Jet Airliner. On August 16th, we will have Fashions Through the Centuries with a very fine volunteer and hard worker here at the Harmon Museum, Sue Watts. On September 17th, Caroline Scott Harrison, First Lady and the first President of the DAR, will be our speaker. She'll be brought to you by Joyce Loving Browning. You might know Joyce. She has been here multiple times, portraying everyone from Annie Oakley to Julia Dent to Martha Washington. And she has another fine presentation for us. And then on October 15th, another good friend of ours, Linda Martin, will be bringing back, after several years, over 100 years of Halloween collections, collectibles. So there are a lot of fine things happening at the museum and a lot of fine presentations coming up on the Lunch and Learn. So enjoy your lunch, and we'll have our speaker in just a few moments. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and once again, welcome to the Harmon Museum's April Lunch and Learn. I'm John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian here. Jim Newport has been an important part of this museum and historical society for 3 years now, a little over 3 years. He is a jack of all trades. He is our facility manager, which means he can fix anything. His topic today is aviation myths, heroes, and oddballs. We could change that to Harmon Museum's hero of odd jobs. When you're done here, you can take a look at how the maritime collection is doing. You can't go in it just yet, but you can still look through it. An awful lot of that is Jim's work, building that facility, hanging up the shelves, and where all that collection will be. He is the creator of the Gilded Moon bar door. He made that. So I don't know if you guys. We have some people who enjoy a good beverage. He first became interested in aviation, or as he puts it, became an aviation nut when he was about 7 years old, and his father took him to his first air show in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at an Air Force base. He had his BS degree in aerospace technology from Kent State University. He has been a docent at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton for 20 years. Since then, he has become a docent at the Tri-State Warbird Museum in Claremont County Airport in Batavia. He is fascinated by aviation and has visited almost every aviation type site in the Midwest. He is a great guy, one of our heroes here at the Harmon Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Newport.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Very happy you're here today. We're going to have a little bit of fun. I will warn you, there's probably a dad joke or two in here. I got a lot of topics to talk about, and I'm not going to talk too long about each one, so I'm telling you something that's boring. Hold on. I'll probably have something that's interesting. So, got a couple of questions before we start. Now, this first question, Carl and Donna, you can't answer this question. Okay? What makes airplanes fly? Anybody?
You're
all on the right track, but you're wrong. It's money.
In today's world.
Money makes everything work. Museums, amusement parks. I used to work at Kings Island, all that stuff. So it's actually money, and you can attest to that, right? Yeah, he's shaking his head. Yeah, absolutely. All right, the next one is, we can all agree that the Wright brothers were the first ones to fly, correct? Everybody agree? Very good. Very.
France, wasn't it?
We'll get to that. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. They were not the first ones to fly. However, I can make that statement true by adding two words to it. The Wright brothers were the first ones to fly an airplane. Heavier than air vehicle capable of taking off and landing under its own power and being controlled. That's what they were the first to do. So let's talk about man's interest in aviation. And we can go back a long, long way. We can go back to 3500 BC. There's actually a gold coin that was found that goes back to that time. And it was on that coin was a Sumerian king. His name was King Etana. And he was flying on the back of an eagle. So 5,000 years, man has been dreaming about flying. 2500 BC, the Incas get involved. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this guy's name right, but Auca, who was Inca civilization founder. He was winged and could fly. 1400 BC, we got the famous story of Daedalus and Icarus. This was a father and son team. Daedalus was actually the guy that made the maze on Crete that they captured the Minotaur with. And Icarus was his son. So they were actually imprisoned on Crete. Not sure why. they must have made somebody mad. But they kept observing birds flying over the island, and they said, you know what? We can do this. Let's collect up a bunch of bird wings and let's make some wax. We'll make wings out of it. We'll fly off this island. So Daedalus, the father, tells his son, now son, behave yourself. You don't want to fly too close to the sun because the wax will melt. Well, we all know that sons always listen to their fathers, right? So Icarus flies too close to the sun, the wax melts, and down he goes, and he perishes. We have the Greek god Mercury, who had winged feet. So even back in mythology, we were still thinking about flying. 100 BC, the Chinese invent kites. So, okay, now we're actually flying something real at this point. This next one, I had to put this in my list because of his interesting name. This was 852 BC, English King Vladimir is the best I can do with this name. But he was killed attempting to fly. So we don't have a real good record with people flying so far. 1162 AD. Now maybe we're getting somewhere. Who knows? There was a man in Constantinople, we don't know his name, makes wings out of fabric with pleats and folds. He jumps from a tower and dies. 1252 AD, Roger Bacon theorizes about human-powered flight, and he assumes the pilot must flap wings. Well, we know that's not true. But then we get to, I'm sorry, I forgot one. We got Da Vinci in here. Da Vinci made his ornithopter, and this was a device where the pilot would actually pull cables and cords, and it would flap these wings, and then he would actually push with his feet. And it also kind of came up with a helicopter. I apologize, I forgot about that. Shame on me. Now we get to these guys. These are the famous Montgolfier brothers, two French brothers. It was Joseph Michel, who was born in 1740, and Jacques Etienne, who was born in 1745. These guys actually were very famous inventors of the time. They dealt a lot with paper. And the Montgolfier brothers were the first ones that came up with transparent paper. They actually patented that a long, long time ago. But Joseph was watching a fire one time, and he saw the embers and all the smoke floating up in the air. And he said, boy, there must be some kind of gas in there that's making everything go. Let's call it Montgolfier gas. Okay, I don't know. Everybody wanted to claim their own thing back in the day. But they started realizing that, hey, maybe we can come up with some kind of device that flies. So they started making balloons, hot air balloons. By the way, this is a replica of the more famous balloon they had. This is actually hanging up in the Air Force Museum. And to give you an idea of the size of it, you can actually see there's a little guy standing right there. So it was pretty big. But they started out with a balloon that was about 30 feet in diameter, put it over a fire, and off it went. It was made out of sackcloth, paper, had 1,800 buttons on it, and it was covered with a fishnet. And off it flew, and it flew very well. So September 1783, they're gonna show this to the king, and it's King Louis XVI. And they wanted to see if it was safe for creatures to fly in it. So King Louis XVI said, let's put two convicts in there, because if we lose them, who cares? Well, I think Marie Antoinette kind of said, yeah, that's a little bit much. Let's not do that. So they decide they're going to put some creatures in there. So they put a pig, a chicken, and a duck. Evidently, they thought the chicken and the duck may be able to save themselves if something happens. But it actually worked. Pardon me. It flew for about 8 minutes, covered about a couple of miles, and everybody survives. And the king was very impressed. So the king okays, now you can put people in it. I decree you can put people in it. So in October 1783, they made a much bigger balloon, similar to what you see here, and they tethered it to the ground. And Etienne, Jacques Etienne, and I took 4 years of French. You'd think I'd be better at pronouncing some of these names, but Pilatre de Rosier. They went up in the balloon, but it was tethered to the ground, so they had made a free flight. That succeeded. So de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlande, I think I got that one right. They did the first free flight. This was November 21st, 1783. So they had preceded the Wright brothers by quite a bit. The flight went about 3,000 feet in the air. It lasted 25 minutes and they flew about 9 kilometers. So they had succeeded. And this is what that balloon looked like. Everybody always, when I was a volunteer at the Air Force Museum, why does it look like that? Well, it was for the king. It had to look like that. They had to make it fancy so the king would be impressed. And that's the reason for all the fanciness on there. But there was actually somebody in between these guys and the Wright brothers that had also succeeded, but not quite an airplane yet. This guy's name was Alberto Santos Dumont. He was from Brazil. As a matter of fact, a lot of people in Brazil say he exceeded the Wright brothers with airplanes. Now, the eyewitness statements for that alleged flight are not, everybody says different things, and there's no photographs of it. So maybe he did. We don't think he did. Most aerospace or air people, aviation nuts don't feel like he did that. But he did succeed in one of these, and this is basically a fancy blimp, if you will. You can probably see there's a structure underneath here, and he's actually sitting up in here, and this has a motor on it with a big fan on the back, and he has controls, so he actually made a flight around the Eiffel Tower and succeeded in doing this. Pardon me, my lunch is fighting back here. So that was, well, I'm working on it here. That was in 1901, and there was actually a woman that actually flew this by herself prior to the Wright brothers. Her name was, I'll find it here, said Aida da Costa, June 19th, 1903. So even a woman had preceded the Wright brothers when it came to flight, but nobody had flown an airplane yet. That's coming, obviously. So we have these guys, and everybody knows about the Wright brothers. December 17th, 1903, they succeeded. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this airplane a little bit later on, but they did a lot of testing. They had a lot of people that they could thank for helping them out. There were several inventors, Sir George Cayley, Otto Lilienthal, Octave Chanute. These were all aviators prior to them that were working with gliders and that kind of thing. But the Wright brothers knew they were going to need a motor for their airplane. So they got a hold of a guy by the name of Charlie Taylor. Charlie Taylor was actually their mechanic. And Charlie Taylor was the one that ran the bicycle shops when the Wright brothers were down in North Carolina. But he was a very good mechanic. The Wright brothers came to Charlie and they said, we're going to need an engine for this thing. It needs to be at least 8 horsepower. Can you help us out? Well, 6 months later, Charlie came out with an engine that was 12 horsepower, weighed about 150 pounds, and worked very well. And another thing they had to help them get through this was wind tunnels. The Wright brothers came up with wind tunnels. They were the first ones to use those. And they made very efficient propellers. So between all that and real good weather that day, they succeeded. And again, I'll talk about the airplane a little bit more here in just a minute. So now we're going to start talking about some interesting people of the day. This young lady is Cornelia Fort. Now, Cornelia was a very interesting woman. She was born February 5th, 1919 in Nashville, Tennessee. She became interested, oh, by the way, she was a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College in 1939. She became interested in aviation at a very young age. She was the second woman in Tennessee to get her commercial license. Commercial license means you can charge people a fee to fly them around. All right. And she became the first woman in Tennessee to get her instructor's license. After she gets her license, she actually gets a flight instructing job in Colorado. And she's working there for a while. She's doing real good. Then she gets an invitation to teach flying in Hawaii. So she takes that up. Yeah, that sounds good. Let's go to Hawaii. So here's a picture of her little interstate cadet. She's giving a flight lesson one day. And there's funny looking clouds going right down through here. And what the heck's going on? Well, she was giving a flight lesson on December 7th, 1941. She was not shot down. She survived. There was actually several of these little airplanes in the air on December 7th, 1941, and they were all shot at by the Japanese. Fortunately, none of the little ones were hit. She did survive, as I said. That, by the way, that airplane is in private hands. That very airplane is in private hands. A guy out in the state of Washington owns that airplane. But so after this goes about, she actually ends up joining the WAFs. And if you're not familiar with the WAFs, pardon me, man, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. What these were was a group of women, and they were hired by the airplane companies and the military, and they would transport planes from factories to air bases or from one air base to another air base. And they did a wonderful service to our country. They freed up the men to go fight the war, is what they did. And believe it or not, most of the WAFs, who became the WASPs later on, the Women's Auxiliary Service pilots, they flew more aircraft than most of the combat pilots because they had to learn how to fly everything. There's actually a very interesting story. The B-29. The B-29 was a great big airplane. It was the same type of airplanes that flew, that dropped the atomic bombs on Tokyo. Well, there was an air base, I believe it was in Texas, where they were bringing in the new B-29 Super Fortresses. And there's a group of military pilots standing there, and they see this thing fly overhead, and they're like, there's no way we're going to be able to fly that thing. And it lands and it taxis up, and all of a sudden, a woman hops up about this tall, says, "It flies great. Have at it." So there were times where the women had flown the B-29s and other airplanes into the airfield. Men had no idea what was going on. So unfortunately for Cornelia, and you're going to kind of hear a pattern coming up here. She was ferrying a trainer from California to Texas, and she was flying with several other pilots, one of them being a man. We won't mention his name because we're going to hate him here in a minute. But as they were flying, Cornelia's flying along like this, and his name was Stammy, his last name. And he starts kind of doing this. He's messing with her. You know, hey, come on, let's have some fun. Let's have some fun. And all of a sudden he goes, she was the first woman's fatality in World War II, flying an airplane. Was Cornelia Ford. So, you guys probably all know this guy. This is the famous Jimmy Doolittle. Everybody knows about the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo. I could do a whole topic on just the Doolittle raid, and maybe sometime. But I want to impress to you, if you ever get a chance to read anything about the Doolittle raid or look at the old movie 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, I highly think you should do that. It's amazing what these guys did to accomplish that mission. And by the way, after Pearl Harbor, militarily, we did almost nothing for 4 months until the Doolittle raid. So it was really quite something. But Doolittle has a very interesting history. September 4th, 1922, he made the first coastal flight from St. Augustine, Florida to California. He was the first person to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours. 21 hours it took him to fly from Florida to Southern California. And he had to make a stop in Texas to refuel. But that's not all he's known for. He eventually, he comes up with this idea. He says, we have these guys making airplanes, but they're not really engineers. And we have engineers that are designing airplanes, but they're not really pilots. We need to combine the two. And so Doolittle actually gets accepted at MIT, and he gets a bachelor's in aeronautical engineering, and then he gets his master's in aeronautical engineering. And then he says, you know what? I can go further. So he actually gets involved in setting up the doctoral program for aeronautical engineering at MIT. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. And he was a natural born pilot. And you're going to see a couple of examples of that here in just a bit. One of the things he did, this was within days of the transcontinental flight, is he wanted to show the military and everybody else that pilots could fly their airplanes just by the instruments in front of them. And there's a lot of pilots that are instrument rated. But this is what they came up with. So they set up an airplane and they put this cover over his head. And you could climb in that and he could seal it up. And this was all he could see while he was flying. That was it. Now they had another guy in this front cockpit just in case, so he could take over the plane. But he actually, when he took off, I apologize. Here we go. The flight they lined him up on the runway. He took off. He flew for 15 miles. In those 15 miles, he did 2 180-degree turns and a few other minor turns to get him kind of back around. The whole time while he was doing it, and he had a stopwatch. The stopwatch was one of the most important things. But the whole time he was flying, he couldn't stay outside. And this was before radio navigation and satellites and GPSs and all that kind of stuff. This was way before that. So he succeeded. He was able to prove to the military that we needed to start teaching people how to fly by instruments. He was also very famous for being an air racer. He flew crazy airplanes all over the country trying to win air races. And one of the airplanes, I was laughing when I see this airplane coming up there. One of the planes he succeeded in was this thing. This was called the GB R2 Super Sportster. GB stood for Granville Brothers. They were the guys that designed this thing. And what they did, they took the biggest engine they could find and put the smallest airplane they could figure out around it. There's the pilot's head right there. It's a tiny little thing. It's a very dangerous airplane. Doolittle figured out that he knew he had plenty of speed in this airplane, so he would be able to beat his competitors on the straightaways very easily. He had 60 to 70 miles an hour more speed than everybody else did. However, everybody else had much bigger wings on their airplane, so they can make the turn, and they could literally have the wings almost completely vertical as they were making the turns. Well, Doolittle, as soon as he flew this airplane, he knew he wasn't going to be able to do this. He was going to have to do more like this. So his turns were going to be a little bit wider. But he told the Granville brothers, he said, don't worry about how I'm flying the airplane, I'll win you the race. Because he knew right away that he wasn't going to be able to do this. So he made big sweeping turns, but he was always ahead. So he really, really was an incredible guy. He actually lived a very, very long life. 83, I believe, he passed away. But it's because of Jimmy Doolittle, we have a lot of the safety precautions we have these days.
Jim?
So,
Hey, Jim.
yes.
He also felt that was the most dangerous airplane he'd ever flown.
Yes. He didn't like it, but he flew it. Yes. Thank you, Carl. All right. This next person, I want to read something to you because it's written a lot better than I can tell you. And at many air shows, this person was noted for an act of which variations are still seen in air shows today. Quite often, during one of these early air shows, there would be an elderly woman thrilled with the spectacle of flight, walking around among the airplanes. She would always receive more than her share of attention because it would be necessary for the local police to escort her off the field for her own safety. Often the announcer would politely ask the little old lady to leave the field. Sometime during the event, the announcer would direct everyone's attention to a particularly important aerial display. While every eye was riveted on the airplanes in the sky, the little old lady would find her way into the cockpit of an airplane whose engine was quietly ticking over. Inadvertently, she would ram home the throttle and make a daring and risky takeoff. The aerial display would immediately be forgotten, and all eyes would be on the lady in the airplane. There would be dives and slips and skids and steep turns, and the airplane would disappear behind a row of trees. Women would swoon and men would faint. Finally, after the announcer had lost his composure, and a dozen times, knowing that the poor little old lady would surely be killed, the airplane would come slipping into a beautiful, perfect landing, taxi up to the line, and out would jump the little old lady. She would then peel off her wig, revealing the incomparable, greatest of them all, Lincoln Beachy.
Wow.
I'm not kidding when I say there's acts like this still to this day at air shows. There really are. Lincoln Beachy was born in San Francisco. However, his father was from right here in Lebanon, Ohio. And he spent time here. The Wright brothers always said that he was the best pilot they ever saw. He really was quite something. He started flying in air shows all over the country, and it's estimated that one year he performed in front of 7 million people. Now, this is back when the population of our country was only 90 million, and he performed in front of 7 million. He actually, at one point, flew over the White House and did a dive toward the White House. Came back up and did it again. Then he went over to the Capitol building and he did that again. And he wanted to prove to the people that airplanes were here to stay and we may want to keep an eye on them. These may come in handy in a war. And so he actually started flying in dirigibles. Then he went into airplanes and he came up with a lot of the maneuvers, the aerobatic maneuvers we have today. He actually got out of flying for a while because he thought, you know, he would go to these air shows and he would hear these people say, "Oh, I just came here to see somebody die. I want to see somebody die." It's kind of like NASCAR races. Everybody wants to see the wreck, or hockey game. Everybody wants to see the fights. Well, Lincoln's like, "No, I don't want to be part of that. So I'm going to get out of the business for him." It was only temporary. Unfortunately for him, March 14th, 1915, he was doing a performance right over San Francisco Bay, and he was doing a loop. And he started the loop way too low, and when he came back around, he hit the water. When he went into the water, the only thing that was wrong with him was he broke his leg. However, the rescue people didn't get to him in time, and he ends up drowning. So that is the famous one and only Lincoln Beachy. Some of these guys are funny. I'm sorry, some of them are. This is Calvert Rogers. Calvert Rogers was, he was the first civilian to buy an airplane, which is interesting because when he was a kid, he had yellow fever and he was actually almost completely deaf by the time he got into adulthood. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania back in 1879. He was the 49th aviator to have an official pilot's license. And it was just, he loved flying airplanes, absolutely loved it. So, October 10th, 1910, William Randolph Hearst sets up a contest, and he's going to give the first person who could fly across the country $50,000 if they do it in less than a month. Now, $50,000 in 1910 was a lot of money, a lot of money. So Calvert says, "I'm all in. I'm going to break this record." So he actually, and this is the plane he flew in, and you may be able to see kind of a green. It says Vin right there, and over on that wing it says Fizz. Vin Fizz was a carbonated beverage company back in the day. They made a carbonated grape soda. So he got Vin Fizz to sponsor his flight. So he gets a small train together, and he's going to follow the railroad tracks across the country. We didn't have highways back then, folks. We barely had roads through the West. So September 17th, 1911, he leaves Sheepshead Bay in New York. He arrives in Chicago, remember, September 17th. He arrives in Chicago on October 8th. He's not even a third of the way yet. But he finally lands in Pasadena on November 5th, 1911. Took him 49 days to cross the country. When he landed in California, there were only 2 original pieces of his airplane left. He had crashed 19 times. In the train, by the way, in the train were spare parts, obviously. His wife traveled along with him, and they had a mechanic shop and all kinds of stuff. So he did not win the prize. They didn't give it to him anyway, but it took him 49 days. Yeah,
Is that a Glenn Curtis was on it?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Took him 49 days to cross the country. We can do it in 4 hours now. 4 hours. So unfortunately for old Cal, shortly after he landed in Pasadena, he was doing a performance, an air show performance, and he flew into a flock of birds. He didn't make it. So have you noticed the pattern yet? It was dangerous to fly back in those days, especially as an air show performer. It was very dangerous. So anyway, that's old Cal. I always call him old Cal. So, well, of course, there we go. Yeah. So this is Blanche Scott. Blanche was born in Rochester, New York, and she kind of inadvertently became the first woman to fly an airplane here in the United States. When I say inadvertently, you'll find out why here in a second. Blanche was actually an auto racer, a car racer. And she was the second woman to ever drive completely across the continental United States. It was part of one of these, things where you could win some money. Now, she did this in 1910. And remember I talked about Cal was 1911. Blanche took 41 days to cross the country. That was a year before Cal took 49 days to cross the country. So anyway, she had found out. Now, there was a guy by the name of Glenn Curtis, and Carl just mentioned him. Glenn Curtis was into car racing, but Glenn Curtis was also into aviation. He was a contemporary of the Wright brothers, and originally they kind of sort of got along, and then there was fights about patents and that kind of thing, and they kind of moved away from each other, but eventually they get back together. But Blanche, and here's about Glenn Curtis, and goes to his facility in upstate New York, kind of the Finger Lakes region. And they're talking about things going on, and Blanche just keeps looking at these airplanes going, hey, can I learn how to fly? And, Curtis says, sure, I'll show you how to fly. So one day, she goes out to the field, and they gave her an airplane where the throttle had a limit on it. It wasn't supposed to be able to go fast enough to take off. So she goes out, she's just going to taxi around on the ground and get the feel for the airplane. Well, either that limiter didn't work, or the gust of wind came up, and all of a sudden she's up in the air. And she didn't panic. She was like, oh, this is cool. She got up about 40 feet in the air. She was in the air for maybe 30 seconds or so, and she brings the plane back down, nice little easy landing. And she says, well, this is great. I'm going to do this for a living. So she ends up being an air show performer. So she was the first American woman to fly an airplane, but she was not licensed to fly that airplane. So she became an air show performer, and she ended up writing screenplays. And later on in her life, she actually worked for the Air Force Museum up in Dayton as a collection specialist. She would travel all over the country looking for rare and unique objects and anything to put in the Air Force Museum. And Blanche lived a long, happy life.
Wow.
Blanche made it into her 80s. I believe she was, let me see here, she was 89 when she passed away.
Jim, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I noticed that all the engines are they like 6 or 8 on a cylinder?
Mhm.
And are all the pilots deaf then? I mean, I saw Lincoln Beach, or
Yeah,
Rolls
yeah.
Royce, and everybody's sitting in front
Yeah.
of all these huge engines. Are they all deaf?
Well, there was no such thing as OSHA back then.
Yeah. No.
No, it definitely affected their hearing. Now, when you're flying, it's kind of behind you
Oh, okay.
a little bit, but yeah, oh yeah, sitting on the ground, yeah. There were no mufflers or anything on this, so yeah, oh yeah, they were incredibly muffled.
And she had to wear a dress, right?
Yes,
Oh.
but hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold that thought.
Something.
So,
I think it's leather.
so we finally get an air show performer that lives a long life. Let's see if that's going to continue. So this is Harriet Quimby. Harriet Quimby probably became the most famous woman aviator back in the day. Harriet was born in Michigan back in 1875. Her first job was an actress. Harriet Quimby was a good-looking woman. She really was. She actually wrote some screenplays. She wrote 7 screenplays, and the movies were actually directed by D.W. Griffith, a very famous director back in the day. She was the first woman in America to get her pilot's license, and that was on August 1st, 1911. And she soon thereafter became an air show performer. She was known as the China Doll, and she was also known as the Purple Princess. And you can kind of see it here on the screen. She had a flying suit made especially for her, and it had kind of a purple hue to it. And she actually had the skirt of her flying suit modified so she could make it into pants. Imagine the scandal. A woman wearing pants. A woman flying an airplane wearing pants. Oh no, what are we going to do? So Harriet goes on, and she's a great air show performer. She was very popular, and she actually got most of her fame from being the first woman to fly a Blériot. This is a Blériot 11 across the English Channel. She was in the air for about 50 minutes. This thing barely makes 50 miles an hour. But it was flyable. Yeah, I know. Doesn't look like much, does it? So we're all, let me see, everybody in here is old enough to remember newspapers, so we know. It looks like. Some of you, I think, are pushing maybe 30, but yeah, like me. So I managed to find a newspaper, a picture of an old newspaper. The headlines the next day when she flew across the English Channel. She flew across the English Channel at the same time the Titanic was sinking. Most newspapers didn't even mention it. She had written articles for the New York Herald. The New York Herald didn't even mention her, that she had done this. Eventually, after about a week, all the newspapers finally started going, oh yeah, and by the way, Harriet Quimby flew across the English Channel last week. But during that day, she was completely forgotten about for that. So, shortly after, by the way, that was April 16th of 1912, July 1st of 1912. It doesn't go well. She was carrying a passenger, and evidently this passenger was a rather large man. And according to witnesses, she was flying along fairly low, and the airplane went nose down very suddenly, and the passenger actually flew out of the airplane. And she didn't have enough time to recover, and she crashed into the ground, and unfortunately did not make it. So that's it for some of the characters of early aviation. I'm going to talk about some crazy airplanes now. And the first crazy airplane is this one. This is obviously the Wright Flyer 1. This was the December 17th, 1903 airplane. The first flight they did was 12 seconds and went about 120 feet. The second flight was about 150 feet. The third flight was about 170 feet. Now the last flight, they made it almost, and by the way, it was Wilbur that was flying. Orville. Yeah, thank you. Orville was flying. Made it almost 900 feet, and it was 59 seconds long. They wanted to keep flying that day, but a gust of wind came up, and it damaged the airplane. So they said, hey, let's pack up the airplane. Let's go back to Dayton for Christmas, and we'll pursue this after the New Year's. So that's exactly what they did. They packed up that airplane. That airplane never flew again. They never flew it. And if you add up the distances of all the flights they made that day, they would just, if you flew it around a running track, a full-size running track, they would just barely make a little bit more than one lap around that running track. So it's probably the most famous airplane in the world with the least amount of distance it's flown. So by the summer of 1904, they had made the Wright Flyer 2, which they had better success with. And then in 1905, they came up with the Wright Flyer 3. And they called that one the first practical airplane. And that is the airplane that's on display up in Carillon Park, the date. That was the first practical airplane. So anyway, most famous airplane that barely flew. By the way, for the 100th anniversary of that flight, they made an exact replica of that airplane. And they took it down to Keokuk and they tried to fly it. And they kind of already knew this, but this airplane in 1903, unless the weather was perfect that day, wouldn't have made it off the ground. The weather had to be just the way it was that day for that airplane to fly. All right. Now, this doesn't look like an airplane. It is actually a training game. This is actually kind of an early computer game, if you will. This came out in the 1930s. And I talked about Jimmy Doolittle earlier, instrument flying. Well, this is a device to train pilots how to fly by instruments. This is the instructor right here, and that's the student. The student would sit up in this little thing. They close the door, close the hatch over his head, and it can spin. This thing can turn, the wings can tilt, and it can go nose up and nose down. This is an instrument flying instructor. The way this would work, right here on the desk, right there, there's a device, and it has wheels on the bottom of it. By the way, it's called the Link Trainer. The Link family was known for making organs back in the day. So there's wheels on the bottom of it, and there's a place for a pen, a marker of some sort to put on there. And as the student was quote unquote flying this under the instruction of the instructor over here, that thing would move around on the table. And they called it the crab because it kind of crabbed around on the table. Now I know all of this is kind of boring, and I get that. Here's the neat part about the story. When I was a docent at the Air Force Museum, I was given a talk one time about the Link Trainer. And a fairly elderly woman came up to me after I was done talking. This was probably 25 years ago. And she said, I was a Link Trainer flight instructor during World War II. And I said, oh, I would love to hear some stories you have. You know, can I talk after the tour's over? She's very, very nice. Her name was Phyllis. Very nice woman. So after the tour, I'm talking to her, and I said, did you train anybody famous? You know, anything like, no, I never trained anybody famous. You know, I said, well, you got to have a story. You got to have, every job in the world has that one story, you know, that people don't know what's happening. And I said, you know, was there something you guys did that nobody knows about? She goes, yeah, well, we kind of had a little fun. She said, what we would do is we would put a blank piece of paper under the crab, and we would get in the Link Trainer, quote unquote, fly it. And we practiced and practiced, and we got to the point where we could sign our name on that piece of paper. I don't know about you guys, but I couldn't walk on the floor right now and sign my name, let alone put a cover over my head and look at instruments in front of me and sign my name. I even asked her, I said, wait a minute, what about dotting the I's and crossing the T's? And she said, well, we just did it. You know, there was still a mark there, but I'm sorry, that's pretty impressive. And I asked her if I could have one, and she said, oh, we pitched them all. We threw them all away. No, I wish. So see, I told you there was something interesting in that story. Anybody want to go have a pancake tomorrow? This is called the Flying Pancake. This was designed by Vought. It was called the V-173. This came out in 1942. And basically, they were trying to come up with an airplane that had the lowest amount of drag you could have on it, and just be basically just a wing. So Vought came up with this thing. Now, it looks like it's sitting at an angle there, and it is. It actually has to sit at an angle like this on the ground because these propellers are so big, and these propellers turn very, very slowly. It had two 80 horsepower engines in it, one for each propeller. And it did fly. It flew very, very well. Charles Lindbergh actually flew one of these one time and he loved it. He thought, this is great. Now, it only flew at about 80 miles an hour. It just kind of, it could never get flat in the air. It was always flying at an angle like this, even though it was flying level, it would fly at an angle. But it was an early experimentation with just a wing. All we want is a wing. So that whole thing was an airfoil across the top of that thing. This airplane is still around. It's on display down in Dallas somewhere. All right, this next airplane, doesn't look that interesting. Just a regular old thing. This is the Culver PQ-12, is it 12? 14, excuse me, the PQ-14. Now, let's talk about that designation. P stands for pursuit. Back in World War II, all the fighter airplanes were called pursuit aircraft. That's why maybe you've heard of a P-51 or a P-40, all that stuff. That P on the front of that means pursuit. They didn't call them fighters back then, even though that's what they were. They were called pursuit aircraft. They do change it to an F for fighter in 1947. So this came out in 1942. So the P stands for pursuit. The Q stands for drone. We were experimenting with drone aircraft back in World War II. Now, the technology was very, very simple back then. And they would actually have to fly another one of these airplanes very close to it to fly it as a drone. They had a great deal of difficulty trying to figure out a way to control it. How were they going to give the signals from one plane to the other one? One of the things they tried. So each number represented a specific command to do. And again, I think we're all old enough in here to remember on the road we're from. Imagine if your commands were the 8, the 9, and the 0. You know, and then you gotta wait. And then you gotta wait. Hopefully this is not go faster or go slower or go up or go down, you know, but it didn't work very well. But, bad joke alert. This is the first known instance of putting your phone in airplane mode. I told you that was going to be one. I told you that. All right. This is another very interesting device. This is the Bell LLRV. Its nickname was the Flying Bedstead. Now, the English actually were using this first. The English were using this kind of shaped thing, and they had the big engine in it, and they were testing the thrusts of jet engines at the time to see how good they were at performing. When we came up with a space program and we were going to fly to the moon, we realized that we needed some kind of craft that the astronauts could learn how to fly in 1/6 gravity and could go up and straight up and down. So the LLRV stands for Lunar Lander Research Vehicle. That's what it stands for. So this is a nice clear picture, obviously, of what it looked like. This particular one, this is a picture of Neil Armstrong actually learning how to fly one of these things. And his LLRV went bad one day. One of the little control nozzles that he was using to keep it level acted up. And this is him ejecting from the aircraft. I think that's him right there. So, and he was only like 100 feet in the air when he did this. And obviously he did survive that. But aircraft don't always look like aircraft. All right, well, I got next. Oh, this is a fun one. Again, it doesn't looks like a normal airplane, right? This was the XF-84 Thunder Screech. Remember the word screech in this. You'll understand why very soon. So this airplane, it's got a kind of a funny looking propeller on it, but it's actually jet engine on the inside of this thing. And this came out in the 50s. This was 1955. So they wanted to make the fastest possible propeller-driven aircraft in the world. The problem with propellers is they don't do well if they're going supersonically. So they designed a propeller that could go supersonically. This thing was the loudest airplane ever made. If this airplane was running and it was out here in our parking lot, every window in Lebanon would shatter. Every one of them. You could hear it over into Monroe and up into Middletown. You could hear this thing running. You could hear this thing running 25 miles away. The ground crew for these things would get physically ill. They made 2 of these. They tried, I think it was 13 flights. 11 of the one pilot flew it and said, he told the Air Force, he said, "You'll have to beat me up to get me back in that airplane. I do not want to fly that airplane again." The other pilot that flew it, out of the 11 times he flew it, he had to declare an emergency landing 10 times. 10 times. Now, to really bring this home, if this thing was flying over our heads, let's say 2,000 feet, you could hear it in Dayton. That's how loud this airplane was. They only made 13 flights, and somebody made the wise decision, I don't think we're going to do that anymore. And by the way, it never broke the speed of sound, except for the propeller. So now you know why it's called Thunder Screech. All right. What the heck is that? So back in the 50s, by the way, this is called the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. This is a great name for that airplane. It really is. This came out in 1948. After World War II is over, we came up with some very, very long-range bombers. There's actually a bomber up in the Air Force Museum. It's called the B-36 Peacemaker. It is huge, absolutely massive. It's got 6 propeller engines on it and 4 jet engines on it. There's actually a recorded mission of a B-36 bomber being in the air for 51 hours. And that's unrefueled. We hadn't perfected mid-air refueling yet. They actually carried 2 crews on that airplane. There was a little, I called it the apartment. There's a little apartment in the back of this thing where the off-duty crew could stay. We didn't have fighters that could stay in the air that long. The fighters are there to protect the bombers. So they said, why don't we come up with a parasite fighter? We'll call it a parasite fighter. And we'll actually make a small little fighter that we can fit in the bomb bay of the aircraft. And they can carry their own fighter with them. So they came up with this thing. Now the wings on this thing can fold up. And here's the hook right here that would hook off to this trapeze looking thing. Now this is not a B-36, this is a B-29, and it didn't quite fit in the bomb bay of the 29. But the idea was when the bomber crew saw enemy fighters, they would lower the Goblin down into the airstream, and the pilot would disconnect from the trapeze, and he would go fight the enemy, and then he'd come back, and he'd hook back up to the trapeze, and then bring it back up in the airplane. Sounds easy enough. There was so much turbulence coming off the mothership of this thing that it was almost impossible to hook back up. Now, these are not wheels for the aircraft. That's just a cart that the Air Force came up with to move it around on the ground because it has no landing gear. And guess what? When you're trying to do that and you can't make it, you're going to land one way or the other. So they actually were a little bit smart on this. They made the bottom of the airplane nice and sturdy, real tough. So if it did have to come in and land on the ground, it could take a lot of damage. They were only able to do this about 50% of the time. Unhooking was easy. Flying was easy. Hooking back up, very, very difficult. And one of the things they got away from is we actually started getting military airfields all over the world. And we could put our fighters all over the world. So we could kind of cover for the bombers at that point. So that's one of the reasons this program kind of died. Now, as John said earlier, I was a docent up at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. And I'm sure at some point somebody's going to say, well, you know where all the aliens are hidden and all the flying saucers and all that kind of stuff. You must know where they are. I can assure you, there's no such thing as flying saucers. Yeah, there is. This is the Another one makes me laugh. This is the Avro Canada VZ-9 Avro car. This came out in 1958. So again, they're looking for a very simple airfoil design. And, you know, there's two cockpits on this thing. The engine is in the center, and they had all kind of ductwork all over the airplane. So you can see there's exhaust ports here, and there's vanes right there. You can kind of control this thing. And did it fly? Absolutely. Now, their plan was that it was probably going to be able to fly up to about 20,000 feet and probably get up to 400 or 500 miles an hour. You ready? The highest it ever got was about 4 feet. The fastest it ever got was about 35 miles an hour. That's it. That's the best it could do. So anyway, it's neat. And this is on display at the Air Force Museum. I firmly believe that many, many years ago, there was somebody at one of these air bases that said, hey, see that thing? Let's start a rumor about flying saucers. There you go. Kind of looks like a Frisbee, doesn't it? Now you know how Frisbees fly. All right. Aircraft are always really symmetrical, aren't they? You know, especially if you're looking at them from the nose, everything is very symmetrical. So you think. This was a German reconnaissance aircraft in World War II. This was called the Grumman Voss BV-141. This actually came out in 1938. It looks ridiculous, doesn't it? It looks ridiculous, but they actually used this during World War II. It was an observation aircraft. The thinking was we can put the observer and the pilot in this thing, and they could pretty much see 360 degrees in every direction. And if they need to look out to this side, the pilot can just tip the wing down or tip the wing up. It actually flew very well. I mean, take a look at this thing. Look at the horizontal stabilizer. It's about 4 feet on this end and 15 feet on that side. This wing is actually bigger than that wing. I mean, it's just crazy. But it flew very well, and it accomplished its mission. And of course, we never did that again.
No.
This is a famous boomerang. Was this a Rutan? Do you know, Carl? Was it Rutan? Yeah. Rutan came up with this thing. I think they only made about 10 of them or something. But, you know, again, look at the horizontal stabilizer back here. Half of it's missing. This wing's short. This wing's really long. And, anyway, so it didn't really catch on. So I think this is the last aircraft I'm talking about. Yeah, this is the last one. Not this one, but back in kind of the Korean War era, we realized that we spent a lot of money, militarily, we spent a lot of money on training pilots. These days, I believe it costs our country like $3 to $4 million just to train a fighter pilot. So they wanted to, you know, if one of our pilots gets shot down over enemy territory, we need to find a way to try and rescue these guys. And, you know, they could use helicopters, but they were thinking, well, let's think outside the box here. So if we can communicate with them and they've landed near a nice flat area, maybe we could drop them an airplane. Doesn't look like an airplane, does it? So this is the concept they came up with. They would actually drop this into an area, and the pilot would be able to unpack that engine, and the pilot would start the engine and attach the exhaust to the airplane, and the airplane would inflate. Now it's kind of a combination of an airplane and a blimp. So I jokingly say, well, they called it a Blair plane or an airplane, but that's not right. They called it the inflato plane. Seriously, that's the name of this thing. Goodyear came up with this, and they came up with this special material. So the top of the wing and the bottom of the wing is made out of rubber, and in between there's these rubber filaments that only allow the wing to get so thick. And there's thousands of these filaments all the way through this airplane, all over the place. They made 5 different kinds of these airplanes. They made a 2-seater in case the crew was 2 pilots or a pilot and a radar officer. They flew fairly well. They inflated in about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on what was going on. And there's still a few of these around. Actually, the Ohio Historical Society actually owns one of these. I wish they would put it on display. I think that would be a great display, but I'm not in charge. So, but anyway, so this is the Goodyear Inflatoplane. All right, just for a few minutes, I want to talk about a few little simple sayings and different things. We've all heard the phrase "the whole 9 yards," right? Everybody heard of that? A lot of people don't know where it came from. Actually, we still don't really can say definitively where it came from. But one of the thoughts is, back in the day, back in World War II, some of the fighter airplanes, the big long belt that all the bullets were set in, some of them were 9 yards long. And the saying was, a fighter pilot would come back to his airfield and he would say, the ground crew would say, "Well, how'd you do?" And, "Well, I didn't hit anything, but I gave him the whole 9 yards." Okay. Some people say it came from the silk that was in the parachutes. It was 9 yards worth of silk. That doesn't sound like enough to me. I know nothing about sewing. I don't, but somebody would say, "Well, how'd you do on your mission?" "Well, I ended up using all 9 yards. I had to bail out." I don't know. But most people seem to think it came from the bullets. You guys probably aware of this, but do you realize that most people have never flown? It's only about 4% of the world's population, 4 to 5% that have flown in airplanes. Planes are very fuel efficient, sort of. Let me get to my thing here. Okay, so you gotta bear with me. This takes some explanation. A Boeing 747, now that's the great big Boeing one, the 4-engine job. They don't really use these for people anymore. They're more freighters. That's about they're all using 747s for. But Boeing 747 is more fuel efficient than your car. The Boeing 747 burns approximately 1 gallon of fuel per second. I know it doesn't sound right yet. Hold on. 1 gallon of fuel per second, or 5 gallons per mile. Reversing this gives us the figure of 0.2 gallons of fuel used per mile. This is much lower than the car's average fuel efficiency of about 25 miles. But considering that it can carry 500 people, you're actually getting 100 miles per gallon per person. So they're more fuel efficient than your car. All right. This one's kind of fun. Let me turn this back on here. I started doing some research on aerial refueling, and I know that sounds really boring, but I have a couple of interesting stories about it. We've been trying to figure out aerial refueling to keep planes in the air for a long, long time. And back in the 20s, they were even doing this. And there were a pair of brothers, the Key brothers, they call themselves the Flying Keys. They actually were going to try and break the record. And they knew the biggest danger they had with aerial refueling was the actual refueling process, getting the fuel from one container into the airplane. And the Key brothers invented a very important special valve to make this happen. It was very safe. The top of the fuel container wouldn't open until this valve was inserted, and the valve wouldn't open until it was in the fuel container. So they actually invented that, and it's very similar to the kind of air refueling we do today. So the Key brothers, they decided, we're going to use our new invention, and we're going to set the record. So they're in Meridian, Mississippi in June. That's important to the story, so hold that thought. So they start flying. They end up flying for 52,320 miles, and they use more than 6,000 gallons of gasoline. And they're flying a small plane called a Curtiss Robin. You ready for this? They were in the air for 29 days. Think about this. They didn't land. They never touched the ground. There's no restroom facilities in that plane. There's no bathing facilities in that plane. The smell had to be atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. But they did it. 29 days. Now, in researching that, I found somebody that did it even better. So this went back in 1956. two guys out in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, this is a Cessna 172. It's a highly modified Cessna 172. They got a big gas tank on the bottom here. They took the door out, they took the passenger seat out and the seat in the back. So then they put a little bed in there. And these guys were able to get refueled from the ground. And these guys still hold a record. By the way, if you fly into Las Vegas, you'll see this airplane. It's hanging from the ceiling in the Las Vegas airport. They stayed in the air 64 days.
Oh, wow.
2 months they were in the air. So, all right, we're gonna have a little bit of fun with this. So I'm gonna make a fool out of myself here.
Oh, awesome.
So we're gonna pretend it is 1939, January of 1938. And you're sitting at home listening to your radio and you hear this radio broadcast, and I'm gonna pretend I'm the announcer and I'm gonna do a goofy voice here. So just bear with me. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jim Newport with WCHS Radio, reporting to you live from Lincoln Field at the Cincinnati Municipal Airport. I have just witnessed one of the most amazing flying experiments ever seen by mankind. 3 Cincinnati aviators, Wendell Fleming, Dan Henry, and Cyril Ketterer, taxied out to the main runway, took off in formation in 3 small aircraft. They took off towards the southwest. As they climbed into the sky, their planes apparently came to a stop and then were suddenly backing up. They backed up over the airfield, still pointing towards the southwest, and were flying towards the northeast. They flew back over the airport and over towards the Milford area, apparently directly over downtown Milford. They slowly descended and came back to the airport, landing exactly where they had taken off from. Ladies and gentlemen, they never turned the aircraft one time, and they were in the air for approximately 45 minutes. This is Jim Newport returning you to the station with WCHS Radio. Good news to you. This is a true story. They actually did this. And I'm sure Carl has done this. When I was learning how to fly, I went to the airport one time, and my flight instructor said, "Tell me what the winds aloft are at 5,000 feet. Well, that's weird. We don't normally fly above 3,000 feet. So we climb up to 5,000 feet. He says, "Turn your airplane into the wind, put it in slow flight, and look down at the ground. Tell me what we're doing." We were backing up. When the headwind is faster than your slowest speed, you can back up. And the headwinds at 5,000 feet that day were approximately 70 miles an hour. So they had this little tiny airplane that could fly at about 40 knots, and they were able to back up. All right. Okay. That was the first Air and Space Museum I ever volunteered at. I got real bored. No, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. I want to talk real quick about the Aviation Trail, which we are part of. And we have the pamphlets here in the museum. And if you're at all interested in anything I've told you here today or any kind of wonderful stories, I invite you all to visit the Aviation Trail. Just this alone will show you how many attractions here in southwestern Ohio we have, and this is not all of them. We're not, the Harmon is not actually listed on this thing, but we're there very briefly. Lebanon, this is from the Aviation Trail website about the Harmon Museum. Lebanon resident Clifford Harmon, a 4th cousin to the Wright brothers, achieved several firsts in aviation, including being the first person to fly across Long Island Sound and the first aviator to carry a female passenger, which was his wife. In 1910, he became the 6th person in the United States to receive a pilot's license. In 1926, Clifford Harmon sponsored the Harmon Trophy for outstanding aviators, aviatrix, and aeronauts, which was balloons and dirigibles. In 1969, a category for astronauts was added, and that year, Neil Armstrong received the award. So, I'm done talking. I thank you all very much for being here. If we have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those. If you want to just come up and talk to me later, that'll be fine too. That's totally up to you.
Thank you.
You said earlier you had a lot for perhaps a second talk. We will take advantage of it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll come up with a plan B.
Well, thank you very much, folks, for being here. Don't forget the discount at the gift shop, and we'll see you next month.